Righty. Okay, here we go. Well, welcome to the channel, and I have a very special guest with me today. I'm privileged to have Dr. Proctor, Reverend Proctor, um, who is a retired university dean, and he began his research in the JFK assassination back in 1974. Since then, he's published extensively, lectured widely, has frequently been consulted by print and broadcast media. Back in the early 80s, he broke new ground in the investigation with his work on Lee Harvey Oswald's attempt to make a phone call from the Dallas jail to John Hurt, who we will talk about in just a few minutes, former military counterintelligence agent in Raleigh. His professional expertise is in statistical analysis, research, pathology, which extends in many practical areas of social science and business market research. Thank you, Dr. Proctor. It's an honor to have you with me today.
It's a great pleasure to be with you, Randy, and look forward to talking.
That's right. Okay, as I mentioned, you began your research into the JFK assassination back in the 1970s, 74, which was may have been more of a kind of a turbulent time back then. There was some with Watergate. I think you would follow that extensively. You want to just let us know how that led you to become interested in the assassination?
Sure. Well, I graduated from my alma mater here in North Carolina, UNC, in 73, and then went off to graduate school and out of state. Excuse me. And so the Watergate trials and not only the trials, but also the congressional hearings were going on. I was fortunate enough to be able to stay in an apartment complex, so there where we were, you could watch the 3 30-minute national news broadcasts in a row. They didn't happen at the same time. So there was a group of us that were following it as closely as we possibly could. So we would rush down, have some dinner in the cafeteria of our apartment building, and then go back up to somebody else's room, one of our rooms, and watch those and everything that we could find out about Watergate. Friend of mine in that group one day said, you know, if you find this Watergate stuff fascinating, you would love to read this book. And he held up a paperback copy of Jim Garrison's book, and A Heritage of Stone. And so I said, well, sure, yeah, let me have it. So in between, I was in graduate school. I was also doing some graduate teaching, following the Watergate, but somewhere I found time to read that, and I was completely hooked. And that, as you indicated, was 1974, and I haven't put down the books yet.
Right. Okay. What kind of stood out as far as the book by Jim Garrison? How did you feel about the assassination before that? Were you weren't interested in it, or just didn't
even think about it? I was in the 7th grade when the assassination happened, so I had a clear memory of that day and how we at school were told about the assassination over the intercom system. But I just sort of said, okay, that's outside. They know who did it, and what a tragedy, and everybody was sad. But that was it. I never gave it a second thought. Didn't know there was a controversy out there. Had not come in contact with books like Rush to Judgment, which I now recommend to everybody who wants to get into it. They get a lot of questions at my lectures. Well, if I want to know more about it, where do I start? Well, that's always where I tell them. I had no idea at that point. So literally every page of Garrison's book was new news to me. And I would go out of our apartment complex and walking up toward the campus, and I found myself at that time looking up on top of some of the 3 and 4 and 5-story buildings that were there and thinking, well, let's see, where would an assassin place himself on that? So those kind of thoughts, no, I never had before. But the main thing was, all of a sudden, I realized that this was a controversy, that there were people who were saying, no, we don't know who did it, and we don't know why it happened, and we don't know who was assisting whom and where the cover-up came. And that that just went straight to my brain. That's the kind of puzzle that I would normally like to solve anyway. And here it is in real life, involving real people and a real president who was really assassinated. So it grew to be strong in importance in what I wanted to know. I started reading voraciously at that point, everything I could get my hands on, and accumulated over the years a huge library of all the books that had been published. And then all of a sudden, people discovered that I knew something about it. They were fascinated, and I got the speaking engagements, and then the writing came, and it just has snowballed. And so we're coming up on 50 years of my research, and I'm still involved.
Right. Now, during your research, we're to fast forward maybe to 1980s. You kind of hit pay dirt, as I mentioned earlier, by uncovering a very significant occurrence that took place with Harvey Oswald tried to make this phone call, and that didn't occur. I mean, everybody knows about, what happened November 22nd, but this happened the next day.
Right.
Very significant event. And I've heard you tell this story many times. I love the way you tell it, and I'd like for you to tell it again. That it's almost like a script writer wrote this, very, very, very fascinating how the people are involved that day, the telephone operators, these two mysterious men in suits,
Right.
And this,
well, and
tell us about
I was not the one that actually, I'm sorry, I'm not the one that actually discovered this, because I found out about it in 2 books that had been published at that time. But the second one of them was the one that it jumped off the page. It was Anthony Summers' book, Conspiracy, which he has now revised and put out under the title Not in Our Lifetime, or Not in Your Lifetime, I believe it is. And I was actually in a train going from Hartford, Connecticut, where I was working, into New York for some business meetings. And so I was reading it on the train. Publisher had sent it to me for my ideas and input on the book itself. And I get to the section where it said that Oswald attempted to make a phone call to area code 919. And I was sort of reading through, oh, that sounds familiar. Okay, I'll keep reading. And then all of a sudden, about 5 seconds later, I realized that's my area code. I was born and raised in Raleigh, North Carolina. Went to school in high school there, went to school at Chapel Hill. So yeah, 919 should mean something to me. And that started things. So the story that you're talking about happened on that Saturday, as you indicated. Oswald had been in custody a little more than 24 hours. He had, at the time we're talking about here, though he couldn't have known it, he had 12 hours left to live. And he had been interviewed all throughout the previous day and all throughout Saturday. No records, no notes ever made, obviously, of what he said or what the questions were that he was asked. But we do know that on Saturday, in the late afternoon or so, he asked to make a phone call from the Dallas jail, and they were obligated to let him do that. And so about somewhere between 10:15 and 11 o'clock, he's going to attempt to make that call. And we pick up the story from the writings or from the testimony to the House Assassinations Committee from one of the telephone switchboard operators. It was in the Dallas Municipal Building where the jail was, who said that a very strange thing happened on that night. She had come into work just a little early, relieving one of her co-workers who wanted to go home early. And she gets there, and her supervisor, who is also in the room, says that Oswald is going to be making a call and they'll be handling it. So they sit there and wait. And a few minutes later, the red light comes on. I should say, first of all, there's a knock on the door of the room where the telephone switchboard is. And they open the door. 2 men come in, dressed in suits, is the way they were described. And neither of the ladies recognized them, but assumed that they had something to do with the investigation and the interrogation of Oswald. And so they wanted to listen in on the call. So they were placed in a side room. I think it was a utility or a storage room. And then they all waited for the call. The red light came on the switchboard and indicating a call coming in from the jail. And both ladies took their cables and plugged in at the same time at their various respectively places on the switchboard panel. And the lady from which we get all of this information, a lady by the name of Mrs. Alveda Treon, said, "Number, please." But at that point, her supervisor, Mrs. Swinney, took over the call. But Mrs. Treon was still listening inside her headsets to everything that Oswald said. So her daughter, who was in the room with her, she worked in the same building and had come to visit her mother. Mrs. Treon's daughter had said, "Well, if anything like this happens, make a note of it. Let's keep it as a souvenir." So Mrs. Treon took out the little long distance phone information pad that they had to write down all the information about any long distance calls, and wrote down all of the information that Oswald gave to Mrs. Swinney about the call that he wanted to make. And so Mrs. Swinney gets all that information. Mrs. Treon has written it for her personal sake on a pad. And so Mrs. Swinney puts Oswald in effect on hold, is what we would call it today, and buzzes into the two gentlemen that are sitting in the side room. She tells them about the call that he's attempting to make. Mrs. Treon at this point can't hear anything because she was only plugged into Oswald's line, not into the two men's line. But she heard Mrs. Swinney, and then there was silence while she was listening to the two men. And then, as Mrs. Treon put it, she was dumbfounded at what happened next. Mrs. Swinney closed the key to the two gentlemen, sat there, visibly nervous and shaking for a while, a few seconds, a minute, whatever, and then gets back on the line with Oswald and says, "I'm sorry, no one answered at that number," and switched him off. Well, of course, she had never attempted to make the call, and the only conclusion that Mrs. Treon could come to was that the two men had said to her, "Don't try to make the call, just tell them it didn't go through." And so that's what happened that night. Mrs. Swinney then left her shift that night. Mrs. Treon was there, and nothing else about the call happened that night. So lots of possibilities. That little phone slip would stay in Mrs. Treon's possession as, again, the souvenir that her daughter wanted for another 5 years until 1968. By that time, Mrs. Treon and her family had moved from Dallas to Springfield, Missouri, which I think had been her home when she was growing up. Family moved there. And one night, one of their mutual friends, a man by the name of Winston Smith, is over at their house. They're having dinner. Subject of the assassination came up because he no doubt knew that Mrs. Treon had been there in Dallas, working in the Dallas municipal building. And they discussed it. She gave the information as to what happened and indicated that he had attempted to make a call. And by the way, would you like to see the phone slip? Well, this Winston Smith was in law enforcement himself, though from an administrative side. He worked in records at the local federal penitentiary there in Springfield. Okay. So he looked at that and he said, I've never heard anything about this. I'm not sure anybody knows. Maybe I should tell the sheriff. And Mrs. Treon said, "Sure, whatever you think needs to be done." So we're assuming the next day, had to have been very, very quickly after that, Winston Smith talks to the sheriff. He hears the information. I think he actually goes over and talks to Mrs. Treon himself, sees the slip, and says, "This is beyond my pay grade. The feds need to know about this." And there was a regional FBI office in Springfield. So he contacted them, explained what was going on. The FBI sent a man over to interview Mrs. Treon. He wanted to borrow the phone slip so that they could make a photocopy of it. And that's how we now know what that phone slip looks like. And so the information was taken to the FBI. Presumably, they still have that in their files. But then nothing was done. Mrs. Treon was not trying to get her 15 minutes of fame or anything like that. She figured that anything that the feds wanted to do about it, they would do. And if they needed her further, they would contact her, but that was it. And the phone slip itself was very interesting. And it became interesting to the House Assassinations Committee, who was convened in the late 70s, to further investigate both the Kennedy assassination and the Dr. Martin Luther King assassination. And an attorney who had worked for congressional offices by the name of Bud Fensterwall had found a way to get hold of a copy of the phone slip itself and had it in his possession, along with an affidavit, a 3-page affidavit that had been written as if in Mrs. Treon's name, saying, I, Alveda Treon, and on this date in this place and so forth, and gave the details. Again, 2.5, 3 pages worth.
Which she didn't really write, did she?
Legal, I'm sorry?
She didn't really write. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, she did not. And in fact, the House Assassinations Committee would give her a chance to read that affidavit, which no indication it had ever been signed. And Mrs. Treon said, I would not have signed this because there are errors in it. Leading up to this, as I said, there were a couple of books that had mentioned it in passing. I don't think either one of the books had given more than a page to it. And all they had to go on was this bad photocopy of the affidavit and the bad photocopy of the telephone slip. And so they drew conclusions from this affidavit material that Mrs. Treon would tell the Assassinations Committee, no, there's wrong information in here. Fortunately, Assassinations Committee sent her a copy, well, had already sent her a copy, and they said, would you please write down what is correct and what is incorrect? Tell us what's wrong in it, and then give us the actual thing that happened. And she annotated that, and we have that. I've seen that in the National Archives. I have photocopies of it and posted a copy of it on my website for everybody to see her emendations to this thing. So the House Assassinations Committee did a long research into this. They ended up writing I think it was about a 24-page report on what they had found. It did not find its way into the House Assassinations Committee report, nor did it find its way into the evidentiary sections that they also published. So it just sat there dormant. And in 1980, I read about it, and I said, and I was writing at that time for a magazine in Raleigh, North Carolina. So I called my editor and I said, I've just found this in this brand new book. And if you want me to, I'll research it. I'll write up something for the magazine. He said, oh, absolutely, do it. This was Bernie Reeves, wonderful guy. He was a powerhouse in publishing in Raleigh, and he wanted that for himself and for his magazine. So we did that, and we did 2 articles in a row. It was a weekly magazine, so we did 2 articles in a row. And that was it for a while. Then there came to be the release of documents, the declassification of House Assassinations Committee documents and their availability in the National Archives. So later on, I was able to go up there, become qualified to be a researcher, and do the index searching for the names of people, Mrs. Treon and so forth. And as we came to know more and more and more, we found the following. That telephone slip mentioned not only Raleigh, North Carolina, mentioned Lee Harvey Oswald as who wanted to place the call, area code 919, and it had 2 telephone numbers. And I recognized the exchanges, the first 3 digits of a phone number, not the area code, but the 3 digits of the number itself, used to all be clustered in geographic groups. And so I recognized them, having grown up in Raleigh. I recognize those as Raleigh exchanges. So, but I did not immediately know what that was. So as we began the research in 1980 for those articles, and then later additional information, I had the opportunity to interview Robert Blakey, who was chief counsel for the House Assassinations Committee, and he sent me a copy of that 24-page report that had been done. And we found out, and I'll try to make this as brief as possible because I know you have more questions, so forgive me for going on so long.
Go ahead.
But what it said was that they had discovered, oh, and the name, by the way, on the telephone slip of the person that Oswald wanted to contact was a man by the name of John Hurt. Those two names were there, no middle initial or name or anything.
Right.
What they found out by talking to the local phone company and other things was that there were, in the telephone listings in 1963 in Raleigh, two men named John Hurt. One was a John William Hurt, and one was a John, is it William? John, I'm sorry, I don't remember the other man's name. He actually did not figure into this very highly.
Right.
And then there was a John David Hurt. The first man, turns out they were able to eliminate him from consideration. He had been age 24 at the time of the assassination. Interestingly, that's how old Oswald was as well.
Right.
But he had been working in the tire recapping business. He had dropped out of high school. It was pretty clear that that was not going to be a person of interest. But the other man was of great interest because John David Hurt, they discovered, had been an agent for U.S. Army counterintelligence during World War II. And the implications of that, or at least the potential implications of Oswald wanting to call someone with intelligence connections when the Warren Commission had been absolutely adamant in their report in 1964 that Oswald had no connections to anyone, did not do the assassination with anyone, did not conspire, was not involved with the organized crime as some thought, with American intelligence as some thought. And all of a sudden we have this connection, and we have it from this lady who has every reason to tell the truth. She was never attempting to embellish things so that she could be famous, nothing like that. In fact, quite the opposite, tried to keep it, low key. And so there was a lot of discussion. They did a lot of research. That 24-page report never got published until I transcribed it and put it on my website because I figured it should be made available to the public.
Sure.
And so the final word from the federal government on this particular story came from that document, in which it came down on the side of believing Mrs. Treon absolutely, indicated that their interviews, excuse me, that their interviews with her showed her to be truthful, that not attempting to embellish, not attempting to do anything other than just say, here's what I know, here's what I wrote at the time. This affidavit is wrong, and I'm going to correct it and tell you exactly what happened. And so they came away saying it really did happen. And Oswald did attempt to make the call. Some had tried to write off the call as well. Some crank, maybe even by the name of John Hurt, but some crank had gotten drunk and called into the Dallas jail wanting to talk to Oswald. Somebody had written down who this person was, but then it really didn't have anything to do with anything, and it certainly was not Oswald. And House Assassinations Committee said, no, it didn't happen that way. Could not have happened that way. Why would someone calling in give not only his phone number, but the phone number of a totally different John Hurt, who just happened to be in the phone book? So none of that made sense. The only thing that makes sense is that Oswald attempted to do it. And we can go on and talk about the implications for him being involved with someone involved with intelligence in the United States. The fact that he was seen and reported later to have been seen, he, Oswald, in the presence of a known CIA case leader, and a man who would ultimately go on to become Western Hemisphere chief of the CIA, was plainly seen to be talking with Oswald in the lobby of a bank, literally weeks before the assassination. So this all comes together into a sense of, doesn't tell us who did the assassination, doesn't tell us really who planned it. So I always talk about it as the narrow slice of pie of the total pie of the assassination. but it does kind of give us a sense that Senator Richard Schweiker was absolutely correct when he described Oswald as having the fingerprints of intelligence all over him. And that's where this is important. This is where it points us in a direction that we had not seen before. And now it not only points us in that direction, but has proof that in fact this happened. And again, any questions you have about the connection between Oswald and Hurt, we can go into that, or whatever other questions you have.
Yeah, fascinating. Now, why didn't the House Assassination Committee include this in their report? You have any idea why?
Yes, I do. I talked to Blakey about that, and he was very forthcoming about it. He said simply, we didn't have an answer. We couldn't go into that and say, well, we've uncovered this, and here's the reason why, and here's this, and here's this conclusion. And so they felt, because it was unanswered at that time and was likely to be unanswered, because shortly after I did the research in 80, and I interviewed this John Hurt as well, and all of that, the year after that, Hurt himself died. So his health was not good at all. And so they just felt, doesn't have a place. We'll hold on to these things. In all of this stuff that we're putting into the archives as classified, we'll put all of that in there. And in fact, there's quite a paper trail in there of their investigation. And I have, again, all that on my website so that people can read the actual documents. But he just felt that it was not something that they wanted. It was a street that they had started walking down, but couldn't find out where it was going. And so they didn't put it there.
And I think they were, had noble intentions as compared to the Warren Commission, the House Assassination, I think.
No question, at the very beginning, their idea was, we want to find every possible scenario that is out there, every possible conspiracy theory, and we want to investigate every single one of them and find out if true, false, or unknown. Didn't actually end up working that way.
Right.
And I still love / am bothered by the fact that, yes, the House Assassinations Committee in its final report did say that the assassination happened probably as a result of a conspiracy, but then they add, and I have this quote actually up in my office. It said, but we cannot, they said that 2 men were almost certainly firing in Dealey Plaza that day, firing rifles, but they could not do away with the possibility of a coincidence. And I'm thinking, coincidence, what does that mean? That means that 2 men ended up in Dealey Plaza at the exact same moment, firing at exactly the same president, that didn't know each other, and it was just a coincidence they were there. And that was a coincidence that they could not say didn't happen. And I'm thinking, I'm not sure about the validity of anything that says that. So I got to look at everything now with a sense of questioning. But nevertheless, they did do a lot of good work. Yes. And the rally call is certainly one of those areas. The lady that headed up that, it was an attorney by the name of Sorrel Brady. She would go on to have a great career in the legal aspects of government and in jurisprudence, and also as a teacher. She was magnificent. Blakey could not sing her praises highly enough. And so, and literally the report that she wrote is very detailed and serves as really the bedrock basis of everything that we know today.
Exactly. And we only have about 3 minutes left.
Oh my, I'm sorry.
Time flies. No. Just how can people reach you? You talk about website. How can we, what is your website, and how can we find out more information?
Sure. It's fairly easy, but it's a long URL. It's groverproctor.us/JFK. Okay. So you just write my name without the middle initial and the junior, right. Grover Proctor, write it together, .us/JFK, and that'll take you to the entire entire site.
That. And just one quick question. You think Oswald was involved with the CIA? They were using him? he was working for him, for them? What do you, your thoughts on that?
A question I'm asked a lot when I give the lectures on the Raleigh call, and very briefly, I will say, if you're even willing to allow a 1% chance that there was a conspiracy, if you're not, then it doesn't matter because he wasn't working with anyone. But if you're willing to at least consider that as a possibility, and you want to find out who he was working with, then you should look at what Oswald did in the year and a half or so before the assassination, and mainly with whom he associated. And you find out through that report of his having been seen talking to a known CIA officer in the weeks leading up, that's one of the people that you have to consider. Was the CIA involved? I don't know. Whether we will ever know. I mean, the people who could have done a deathbed confession have probably already had their deathbed, and so it's probably not going to happen that way. But it at least puts paid to the idea that Oswald was just this lone nut who lived by himself and who had all these murderous thoughts going on in his head, and he did it by himself. Can't have that anymore. It just doesn't wash.
That's right. Dr. Proctor, thank you so much. We're out of time. I really appreciate it. And I could probably go on another hour or so, but unfortunately we're out of time. I hope I can speak to you in the near future.
If you want to continue this on another time for the second half and all of the other things that came after, I'll be very happy to do it with you.
Thank you so much, sir.
Have a great day.
Okay. Nice to meet you.